Well, welcome into a special bonus edition of the Eye on College Basketball Podcast. We actually don't do a ton of guests on the pod, but the man joining us today is obviously a worthy, willing, wanting exception to that. It's Dan Gavitt, who is Senior Vice President of Basketball for the NCAA, a man I've known for a long time, had many good chats with over the years. And listen, we're right on the doorstep of March. A lot of things tied to the NCAA tournament have been increasing in buzz and speculation. This is an awesome season right now, so wanted to get Dan on and have a good long-form chat, and more than happy to do so. Dan, thank you so much for joining us here on the show. I believe this might be your second time we've done something on cam for the pod, but it's great to have you back.
Thanks, Matt. It's always great to be with you, talk with you, and appreciate how you cover college basketball.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Let's talk season right now. It's been a pretty awesome year. You know, I remember you were at the CBS Sports Classic, and first of all, time flies in the every single year, Dan, like we get to this week where March is around the corner and I'm like, wasn't I just having Thanksgiving dinner? But nevertheless, here we go. When we were talking, though, we were talking about the early storylines of the season and how good the SEC was, and we'll get to the SEC. But when you take stock of everything that's happened over the past, near 4 months at this point, for you, basketball lover, basketball lifer, by the way, what stands out? What excites you? What are your biggest takeaways on the precipice of the most important month of the year?
Well, just a highly competitive, compelling season, right from the early part of November, and certainly of late during conference play. Even last night, games watching super late, from coast to coast. And clearly, as you noted, Matt, the SEC is historically deep and playing out just to be a really compelling, exciting, and fun conference to follow. But it's not the only one either. The Big Ten is having a fantastic year as well. The Big 12 obviously is always good. And so it's really from coast to coast been a really fun season. And I think because of conference realignment and seeing teams in different leagues this year, larger leagues, knew it was coming, but this is the first year that those 18 and 16 team leagues, the autonomy conferences, are playing college basketball. That's been interesting to follow as well, as you had more, games that are now conference games that would have otherwise been high-level intra-conference matchups in the past.
Yeah, the committee met last summer, and I wrote about this back in January at the Court Report. Probably have a breakout story that will update the timestamp on that, so people wondering about this kind of stuff as they look to discover it as we get into March here, just about seeding principles and all that. And we'll get even more to that in just a second, Dan. But I'm wondering if the scale of which you're seeing this with the SEC and others, from a scheduling standpoint, from a results standpoint, is even more than you might have anticipated when you all met last summer and said, okay, here's where we might need to relax this certain principle and tweak this because of the fact that we're going to have a landscape in college basketball that we've never had before. And by that, it's obviously 4 super conferences plus a 5th high major in the Big East, which is a more traditional size of 11.
I think actually the committee did a really good job of anticipating what the new landscape could look like and what the ramifications of that could be, from evaluating teams, non-conference, conference schedules, overall schedules, and then the impact on selection, seeding, and bracketing in particular, as you know, with more teams from one league potentially being in the field. So I know we're going to talk about that probably in a little bit here, but I do think that the committee did a really good job proactively of anticipating some things that we're seeing now playing out and things that the committee will be faced with during selection meetings.
Okay. What is, for those who are dialed into college basketball, know who you are, maybe seen your name in print, seen you on TV here and there. You're obviously a very prominent figure in the sport, and deservingly so. Can you give a synopsis of what you do in regard to the tournament? What your role is in the committee room, and big picture, how you fit into helping build the tournament and oversee the committee and what it does.
Well, first, I've been at the NCAA for 13 now years this August. And oversee the men's and women's basketball championships, divisions 1, 2, and 3, the NIT, the WVIT, and they get involved with all sorts of other things around college basketball and committees that work on the game. But as it relates to working with the men's basketball committee, I am in the selection room for the entire time. Our job as staff is generally to make sure the committee is following the principles and procedures that they put in place for selecting seating and bracket in the field, but also be a resource always to, putting things in historical context and what decisions might be precedent setting for the future. The process is only an annual process. So, what happens last season doesn't carry into what happens this season. Yet history is important, and keeping with the principles and procedures of how the field is selected, seated, and bracketed is really important. The recusal process, making sure that committee members are not in the room when their team is being discussed or voted upon, for example. So just serving as a reference in those ways and a facilitator. And then I think I've gotten the trust of the committees over the years because I watch and follow basketball very closely. I watch a zillion games and follow the teams, analytically. And so, there are times that they'll ask for my opinion or on a team or a vote that they're about to take. And if asked, I offer my opinion. It is nothing more than that. They take that and make their own decision based on their own conscience. I don't vote. I don't have any voting privilege in the room, but I think they've relied on me to be a trusted source of information and a resource in their difficult work.
Okay, good deal. Anyone ever jokingly be like, Dan, I could use some more food. Can you just run out and get me something? Oh, I got voting stuff to do here. I'm looking over this team sheet. Dan, I'm waist deep right now in strength of record. Can you just get me a cup of coffee? Anyone ever do that to you?
No, I haven't. But I'd do it if they asked. And we feed them well. We definitely feed them well.
Yeah.
The ice cream is famous, as I think.
The Sunday, is it still a thing? The COVID didn't get rid of the Sunday bar. That's still alive and well.
That is alive and well. I would be fired or disgraced if I did away with it. So I'm not going to.
You know what? That's a good point. I think for the amount of trust that's in that committee room, I'd like to believe that if you got rid of the Sunday bar, you'd have some folks finding me under the cover of darkness and looking to report that. That's an exclusive that I would be all too willing and eager to report on. We'll get into some more of the particulars in the committee room a little bit later. But let's get into real quick. You said it's an annual thing, every year in March. That's true, but also what's become the annual thing is the meeting in February. We had the top 16 bracket reveal on CBS. Let's go back to last month real quick. The committee convenes for a few days, and aside from picking the top 16 resumes, and aside from that, what else is learned specifically at that annual get together? And in your opinion, why has it become a pivotal in-person conference for the committee before everyone meets again in person for the real thing in March?
It's practice. That's the most important thing. It's literally a full exercise of practice for what they're going to do a month later in a real game scenario, right? So they select, seed, and bracket the field. For new committee members, it's invaluable as they share with us every year because they get to do the exercise in real time for the first time before it's under live fire in March. But even for ongoing committee members, it's a great refresher on the process. It is very much a process. It's a voting process. There, as I mentioned, there are principles and procedures and recusals that we follow very, very carefully. And just going through the cadence of all that is really valuable in their preparation for what they will do 3 or 4 weeks later during the actual selection week. And this year, Matt, we did something a little bit different, a little bit more in full, I guess, because the Committee of 12 has 5 new members this year, which is unusual. Usually it's only 2 members. There's been some turnover. So we have 5 new really excellent members. But because nearly the entire half of the committee is new, and one of the committee members only had 1 year of experience, we actually did some of the business in advance of the in-person meeting and went through the entire process and tried to emulate what it's like to be picking those last teams late on a Saturday night. It went through some different brackets based on different seed lists, like we are always faced with in Sunday, with different conference championship games going on and the possibility of upsets, And so I think they got even a fuller taste of what they're going to do here in just a couple weeks' time. And it was really, really beneficial for the new committee members and the ongoing ones as well.
I really love the nitty gritty on that stuff. I am just naturally curious, though, that you've revealed that. It had to, I'm assuming it had to have been on a little bit of an accelerated timeline versus the real deal that they'll do in March. So did you feel as though the process that they were going through and with what you're saying here, building out a field of 68 and putting the final teams that at that point in the season had just made the bubble cut line, they were getting, it was a full on dress rehearsal all the way through.
It was, it was truncated, so it was only 2.5 days versus the 5 full days there is in March, but we kind of time stamped it to say, hey, we'd be on Wednesday afternoon at this point, or we'd be on Thursday evening at this point. And when we emulated the Saturday night experience, it happened to be the last night the committee was in town, and it was about 9 o'clock at night. Now, usually that's midnight during selection week, but they were tired. They'd had a long day. They'd already had dinner and ice cream, and so they felt the kind of feeling of what it's going to be like to be a little fatigued and have to make those hard decisions at the end of the process.
All right, there we go. I just love the image of just committee members being like, I didn't need that second helping of mashed potatoes. All right, tell me who's on the 11 line again, please. Love that. Let's get into a topic that I wrote about in January that I expect to be among the 3, 4, 5 most discussed things during conference championship week, and that is the SEC and the challenges that will come with seeding this conference. And just for everyone listening, as a general traditional rule, committee chair, Dan, committee members, they generally don't get on the specifics on teams, but we do have an unprecedented situation. So Dan, give me as much nuance and detail as you possibly can here, because we don't know if it'll be 11, 12, 13, or 14. It's going to be one of those 4 amounts of teams that get in, but we've never had that before. Now, we had the Big East in 2011 set the record with 11 teams. The SEC, barring some unthinkable plot twist, will get at least 11, and it could have, again, 12, 13, or 14. What are the principles in place, and what should people that are specifically fans of the SEC, not rooting for rematches early in the tournament, what things are unavoidable, what things have been flexible, and what was learned in the February bracket practice exercise that you really are bracing for, because this will be a fascinating subplot to see where these teams get seeded, what you're not willing to compromise on when it comes to seed integrity, and what inevitabilities might await in the second round.
Sure. Well, coincidentally, I was working at the Big East Conference in 2011 when the Big East set that record, so I've seen it from that perspective. And I do agree that the likelihood of that being tied or broken this year by the SEC is very high, given the strength and depth of that great conference. We did learn some things during this selection orientation process we just spoke about. As part of the top 16 reveal, there were 6 SEC teams. In that top 16, there were 5 in the top 6 seeds, indeed. So reminder of a couple things. One is that the top teams from the same conference, the top 4 seed lines, are put into different regions. Okay, so that hypothetically, 4 teams that are in top 4 seed lines from the same conference could all advance to the Final Four. When you have a 5th or 6th team, that doesn't work. So you would have to have a second team from the same conference in one region. When those teams might face each other in the bracket is a determinant of how many times they played during the regular season and conference tournament. If they played 3 times, they couldn't meet until the regional final. If they played twice, they could meet in the Sweet 16. If they only played once, they could meet as early as a second round. So the committee, anticipation of maybe more teams from one conference being in the field, talked about this in the summer, and they also put in into the principles that should 9 teams or more make the field, that some of these principles could be relaxed because they may have to be in order to create a bracket, with so many teams from one conference in the field. So, when the bracket comes out, it's undoubted that if there is that many teams that you speak of from one conference, that there's going to be the potential for teams from that conference to face each other, maybe earlier than fans may anticipate. But it'll be followed by the principles and procedures, and depending on how many times they played, those opportunities for matchups in conference would be later in the field. But we anticipated that, and I think we're well prepared for that should it come to play in a couple weeks' time here.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. Oh, what will also be interesting is the SEC plays its title game on Sunday traditionally. The SEC and its coaches have been very vocal, as I know Dan knows, about that title game just basically not mattering whatsoever because it's one data point and whatever. But I bring up the title game in particular because you could have a situation there where teams are either meeting a second time, which could affect gently where people, but if it's a third time for whatever reason, whatever two teams, if they meet in the title game, maybe it doesn't matter because it's Alabama and Auburn and they're both 1 seeds and they're on opposite ends of the bracket and it just doesn't play. But there is a chance that the SEC championship game could wind up forcing you guys to have a contingency bracket ready. I'm laying this out as my interpretation. And Dan, would you agree with that? If it's a third matchup in the title game and it's not a traditional, it's not a team projected to be a 1 seed, then you might have to have a contingency bracket available to avoid a meeting again, because you obviously don't want to have teams meeting a fourth time prior to the Elite Eight.
Yeah, I don't know if we'd have to have a contingency just based on that, because we'd know on Saturday night, Matt, that would be the third meeting the next day, right?
Yeah.
What it could play out to be, though, is that the seed list could be different depending on who wins that championship game, right? So when you have different seed lists, then you have to have different brackets as well. And so there are times on Sunday where we have as many as 5 or 6 different brackets that are built, because the seeding is different based on the outcome of the SEC championship game, the Big Ten championship game, the Atlantic 10 championship game, or even the Ivy League championship game, which is on Sunday as well.
It's true. Let's discuss a storyline that I don't think it's gotten quite enough traction yet either, but it really might in the next 7 to 10 days as people start to pay more attention to daily bracket updates. And it's the compelling nature of teams that might fall in that, I'm going to say 8 to 10 seed range. And now some of these teams could play themselves above it or below it. But Dan, I'm talking about the back-to-back reigning champs, UConn. I'm talking about a Memphis team that has done really well in the non-conference. We'll see. It could well play its way out of this, but I think they're a potential candidate. Illinois has taken its lumps lately, but that's a really talented team. Gonzaga, as we record this right now, Gonzaga was able to win at Santa Clara earlier in the week. It's got a game at San Francisco. If it gets that, its tournament fate should be okay. I don't need you to speak specifically on any of these teams' resumes, but what I do want you to speak on is one, if you've taken notice of the fact that this is potentially populating. Now, we normally get 8, 9, 10 seeds, like they're quality teams, but I don't know, Dan, it feels like this year to me, agree or disagree, that the teams that might wind up in those slots just might be a tad more dangerous in a potential second round matchup with the 1 seed or 2 seed than in some recent seasons. I mean, the idea that maybe you could have like UConn face off against, I don't know, even the likes of a Florida or a Bama, that'd be a Final Four rematch, of course. That to me would bring even more compelling nature to the tournament if it indeed plays out.
I don't think there's any question, and we experienced a little bit of that during the selection orientation meeting in bracket. Recognize that some of those very successful programs at a high level, Final Four national championship level, in the past, maybe in that 8, 9, 10 seed line, and would set up really compelling and, on paper at least, highly competitive and scary matchups for 1 or 2 seeds in the second round. Now, we've seen that more regularly recently, that games that happen to fall in the second round are games that I think those of us who have followed this for some time would typically see in the regional weekend, right?
Yeah.
But it makes just that much more a compelling and exciting tournament when you have that possibility that those matchups could come to fruition, and that certainly would be a challenge for 1 and 2 seeds to see. Some of the teams you mentioned have had some injuries. If they're fully healthy by March and the start of the tournament, that's a different team maybe than is playing right now near the end of the season. Some of them, because of the mobility of players now with the transfer portal, sometimes teams, it feels like chemistry, takes longer, to come together, and they play, maybe at their highest level latest in the season. But when the committee is seeding teams based on the entire body of work, it's they do the best they can with seeding, but it's how you're playing once you enter March that really determines maybe success during that month.
Yeah, it obviously determines success, and I know the hardcores know this, but as a reminder, because it still seems like there's a small faction of folks who love the tournament, love March, your final 5, 10, 15, 12 games, it just isn't part of selection criteria. It hasn't been for a long time. Doesn't mean that those teams can't get hot and continue to play well, but that is not a factor there. You did mention injuries real quick. I did want a quick reaction from you on that, because it's all situational, circumstantial. Some injuries are more than others. In the committee room, in the past 10 years or so, broadly speaking, Dan, like how much is a team's injury situation taken into effect? And even beyond that, the stuff that matters, how often would you say an injury, active or not, the team didn't have this guy for the first 6 weeks, or this team doesn't have him now and they have him, like how much does that wind up affecting a team seed? Does it happen 5% of the time, 1%, 10%? Just broadly speaking, how much do injuries play an impact in how teams get seeded?
Well, the committee definitely does take into consideration player availability, because to otherwise not do so would not be fair or reasonable to a team's evaluation over the course of an entire season. And getting seeding right is really important, not just for the team that is seeded, but for any of their opponents that could otherwise face a team that's underseeded or overseeded, and thus create some imbalance in the regions and the competitiveness of the tournament. So it's always recognized and taken into consideration at some level. I would say, though, that how it actually plays out over a 35-game resume in most cases is pretty minimal when it comes to seeding. It's not dismissed. There have been cases where a team, I think, has moved up or down a seed line, because games that they may have lost without a key player are taken into consideration. But I'd say it's not frequent, and I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it, but it's a lower percentage than people probably recognize. But the alternative is that you don't consider that at all. I don't think the committee has ever felt comfortable that you shouldn't take into consideration injuries, because it can have a significant impact on a team's success and competitiveness, especially if it's a player that's lost for the year, right, and is not coming back, and you have to evaluate a team based on a different roster.
Yep, for sure. The big ones are rare, thankfully. Kenny Martin might be as notorious, unfortunately, as any. In that year, Cincinnati would have been a 1 and got dropped down as a result of that. There are new metrics on the team sheet this year: wins above bubble and Bart Torvik's rankings. That brings the number of team sheet metrics to 7. Sagarin was recently on it and no longer is. Why did the NCAA decide to adopt these specific 2 metrics, Dan? And specifically, I'm curious, what events, conversations from recent years prompted the discussion to include more?
Well, I'd start with Bart Torvik's. First of all, as you mentioned, Sagarin no longer has his rating. So we had lost one of the predictive metrics that was on the team sheet. There were 3 with Sagarin plus the net. So losing Sagarin, we thought it was reasonable to replace that predictive metric. And Bart Torvik's metric, I think, has been referenced much more frequently and regularly now than in previous years. It's been adopted fairly widely. And so after talking with Bart, that seemed to be a very obvious choice for a new predictive metric to replace Sagarin. Wins above bubble, we use the net data to create that. There are others that use different data that underpins the wins above bubble. That had been referenced by committee members kind of informally the last few years as a way to try to, that's a results-based metric, as you know, and comparing resumes of teams had gotten more and more, kind of adoption and use, I think, by both committee members and coaches and media that follow the metrics and analytics that the committee uses. And I think already it's been very interesting to be able to compare teams with that metric. And even during the selection meeting, got some play that we anticipated, and we're glad we've added it, because it just adds a new lens to look at teams, and when you're comparing one to another, especially with quite different schedules they've played.
No doubt about it. It's a very important one. Glad to see it on it. I lauded the NCAA last year when you guys decided to add it there. I think it's an important metric, but it's one thing to have all the metrics, and it's another thing to know how to properly interpret them and use the data. I am hopeful, slightly skeptical, that the athletic directors and the commissioners that make up this committee, with your guidance and many others on the NCAA staff, you know who you are, you do a wonderful job. How, to the people that really care, and there's so many of them, as you know, Dan, about how the tournament is selected and seeded, how can we be more assured that the committee is really using the data in the right way, know what it's looking at, in addition to conversations that, listen, I've seen this team so many times. For people that might not be aware, people on the committee are assigned certain leagues, and the landscape is fully covered from that perspective. But when it comes down to, okay, this person just joined the committee, they're in year 1 in 2025, and there's this metric called wins above bubble, and there's one that's been on there for a few years called strength of record. How do we know they know what they're looking at and to implement it when it comes to seating and selection?
Well, we do a really very thorough orientation with committee members when they come on the committee, and then on an ongoing basis, educating them on what each metric is measuring, how it's been formulated, if there's a way to describe that, and how it should best be utilized. And then because we do practice and go through the selection orientation meeting, we have a chance to kind of talk about how they should be considering each metric individually. And then we have some experts in the room. David Warlock, as you know, is our media coordinator and is probably our foremost analytics savant in the room that can answer questions. We provide even written material on what the metrics measure and how they should be utilized in the process. We just think that the more data you can bring, the more data points, the more metrics generally that can be utilized, the richer the process. You ask a very good question, and we're mindful of that. I think committee members in general serve 5-year terms, and in general, they get better. They get more experienced and more knowledgeable about the process each successive year, and then can pass that knowledge along to their newer committee members and colleagues.
The committee expanded to 12 a few years back. When will the NCAA, I'd say, modernize and welcome in members of the committee who aren't commissioners or athletic directors? There are many qualified candidates. I know you know some of these people personally, Dan. Perhaps even more neutral observers, I might argue, who could do the job, who could be added to the committee. The CFP committee does have this in football. Isn't it time for the NCAA to step in and consider entering a new era with a little bit more diversity on its selection committee?
That's a membership decision, Matt. I think we're always evaluating, which is why we went from 10 to 12 members, and even how the committee is composed just in the last couple of years. The Division I's going through a governance review right now where, based on the pending House settlement and some of the new things that are a reality in Division I are being considered about how best to structure it. And with that, I think is going to be a review of how committees are composed and who serves on those committees and who has permanent representation and what the mix of those committee members and their conferences should be. So I think anything's possible in the future. The committee has always been, one of the most sought after things that someone can do in their professional career, whether you're an athletic director or a commissioner. So, in some ways, it's hard to imagine them not wanting to have that opportunity and passing it down to junior members of their staff or others in the business. But I think we're going to continue to look at things and see how best to do them in a contemporary and relevant way. And if that's something that the membership thinks should be adopted, then we'll consider it.
Here's to hoping. Membership, let's step it up here. We can get a few folks that aren't careerists in college athletics and have their voice be heard in the room outside of the people who have done a fine job. I have a question on bracket matrix. We've never talked about this before. If I was in charge, if I was in your spot, I think an informal rule I would have, because I don't want the tail wagging the dog, is I would strongly insist, even though I can't control human behavior, every single committee member not to look at bracket matrix. It's a wonderful resource, but I don't like the idea of a very widespread resource that is collectively taking dozens and dozens and dozens of bracket forecasts on a day-by-day basis and having the committee, any given committee member, referencing it and being like, that's interesting. I had this team as a 9, but bracket matrix has them as a 7. Maybe I don't like the idea that they could be influenced. So have there ever been discussions? Have you or anyone else at the NCAA level tried to take a step to proactively just say, hey, listen, when you're on the committee, let's not reference this because we want to have this process be siloed off from any outside undue influences?
Yeah, we talk about that just in general, bracket matrix aside, because, I think one of the goals of bracketology broadly writ is to predict what the committee's decisions are going to be, right? So if you, subscribe to watching someone else's bracketology decisions, you're looking into the mirror in many ways, right? And I think the committee needs to be the leader because that's their job, right? Their job is to be the independent thinkers, and they're given that important responsibility. So, I can't swear to how every committee member prepares, but we do talk about that a lot, that, that making sure we stick to the watching that they do a ton of from November on, watch a ton of games, follow all the metrics and and all the statistics that are available, but then have their own independent thought as to how they prepare and then vote on the selecting and seating the field.
On that voting, selecting, and seating, can you just refresh viewers and listeners as to how this happens? Most people may not realize, some might, that it's not like everyone that's on the committee is aware of how everyone else is voting. So paragraphs worth of thought. How does that actually happen, and who actually gets to see how each and every committee member votes?
The votes are private. They're confidential. So no committee member sees what another committee member's vote is. And the votes are generally done in groups of 8 or 4, where you either list teams for their selection or seeding, and then rank them either 1 through 8 or 1 through 4, depending on what the vote is. So each of the 12 committee members has a say in where a team is ranked in that particular vote. And it is a confidential process so that committee members can vote their conscience without undue influence.
But don't you, committee chair, anyone else get to see all the votes in collective and just as a means of supervision or whatever reason there might be? I
do.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's get to the big one. We're 30 minutes in. We got to get here. Where do we stand on NCAA tournament expansion as of right now, Dan, or lack thereof? What's the status of everything?
No new information. Nothing that's imminent or even anticipated to happen here in the short term. The committees are continuing their ongoing analysis of whether or not to expand the championships, and if so, how to go about doing that. Their focus right now, late in February and early March now is on the 25 championships, and there will continue to be some discussions about expansion in the future, but right now their focus is really on this year's tournament.
You don't expect a vote to happen in March about the fate of the tournament, in the near future?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. And for those that might not be aware, in order to make a change to the tournament format, what is the deadline that has to be met in order for a change to happen, at the soonest possible next year?
There's not a specific deadline, Matt, but if we're talking about the 26th championship, having a timeline to operationalize that is important, and it'd be sometime this spring a decision would have to be made.
So theoretically, there could be a vote, a decision, one way or the other. If it were to be expansion, you could theoretically have a vote on that, say by mid to late April, and still technically have a change to the 2026 tournament if we got to that point?
Theoretically, yes.
Theoretically. I was told by a few sources that if there isn't money to be made in the new tournament format with expansion, be it 72 or 76 teams, some well-embedded sources tell me that their belief is that it will not happen. I even had a source recently tell me that some of the really prominent voices in college athletics are on that side as well, that if expansion means less money coming to their particular conference or their schools and how it gets split up with units, then that could be a real point of resistance. Do you agree with that? And how much of that is a major factor when it comes to deciding whether or not to expand the tournament?
Everything's a major factor. I mean, first of all, the analysis and consideration has been very thorough. It's not taken in a lighthearted way at all because of the success of the tournaments and how important they are to college basketball overall. Expansion, even in a modest level, is complex, more complex than I think than has been recognized and reported, because it is expensive. It's expensive because of additional team travel, per diem, game operations, but also the basketball performance funds that you may be alluding to, that they're the units that are earned throughout the men's and women's basketball championships now. If there's expansion, the basketball performance funds would have to have their budgets increased as well, or else there's dilution of the value of those units over time. And that is a very real factor in this consideration, is the finances around that.
When you say that's a very real factor, do you feel like that might be the biggest factor, the point of contention, the discussion point that's existed in that committee room and in NCAA hallways over the past 6, 12, 18 months, Dan?
I don't know if I'd rank or put one thing above another, but it's a significant factor. I think it's a significant factor because revenue is a significant consideration in almost anything in college athletics right now, right? Because of the House settlement, because of the resources that are needed at the school level, the conference level, and at the NCAA level. you have to make decisions in a responsible financial way. I don't know if it'd be where I'd rank it, but it's certainly a significant factor.
Where do you land on this argument that because in 1985, when the tournament expanded to 64 teams, at that point, there were only so many schools at that point. There were fewer than 300, and so the Division I has expanded, and so the tournament is due to expand with it. Do you find that to be an argument that carries weight factually, statistically, or is this perhaps a talking point on behalf of those just looking to find a reason to bloat the tournament?
Well, look, it's factual, right? It was way fewer than 300. I want to say it was like, the mid 200s was the number of Division I schools back when the tournament expanded 40 years ago, from over a 5-year time period from 32 to 64 teams. So it's been a very, very long time since there's significant large scale expansion. We know that it expanded from 64 to 65 and 68 over the last, decade or so. But you have to go 40 years to look at massive expansion. I'm compelled maybe slightly, but I think I'm more compelled, if at all, that the highest level of college basketball has gotten much more compressed. And that's happened very recently. As a result of conference realignment, you have more conferences, fewer conferences with much larger memberships. And many of those conferences that had several successful historic programs have now kind of coalesced into 4 of the Autonomy 4 conferences that are now either 16 or 18 schools in size. And so I think that's as much, if not more, of a factor than the overall growth of Division I.
Yeah, and it was those commissioners that decided to do that. I have the number, by the way. It was 282 in 1985. Since then, 91 teams have joined Division I. 6 of those are no longer active D1 teams. The overall win percentage is 18%. But if you actually take out the fact that some of these teams had to play each other in the first 4 on those Tuesdays and Wednesdays, the win percentage drops down to about 10%. So with rare exception, and there has been exception, FAU got to the Final Four. It joined Division I after 1985. Wofford was a 7th seed about 5-6 years ago. It joined a D1 after 1985. Very, very few teams that have joined Division I have actually gotten in as that largest period, and their win rate is not that high overall. I want to pin you down on this. If I leave this up to you, where do you fall right now on NCAA tournament expansion? You're a very powerful figure in the sport, well respected. For people listening, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say it right here in front, Dan Gavitt is about as well liked and well respected as a person that exists in NCAA athletics. That's just a fact of the matter. If I left this decision up to you, do you want to see the NCAA tournament expand? You have a basketball lineage. You were in the Big East. You're a former coach. You have known this game your entire life. You have lived in this tournament and outside of it. If I leave it up to you, would you keep it at 68 or would you expand the field down?
Matt, I haven't actually formed a final opinion myself on that. I will say that my thinking has evolved over the last 2 or 3 years around this topic. I would say that if you'd asked me that question 2 or 3 years ago, but a simple and quick answer of no. I don't think the tournament should expand. I'm still not necessarily sold on whether or not it should expand, but I think there's so much that has gone on and changed in just the last couple of years. And I think we have to look at not just now, we have to look at the future and what our current membership makeup looks like. As I mentioned just now, there are larger conferences that are really deep and have incredible resources that invest in college basketball, and yet there's no sport that has more that's deeper overall and has more parity than men's college basketball. There's great basketball played at every level in men's basketball right now. So I think it's important to keep the tournament contemporary and relevant based on what is going on in college athletics. And because there's so much that's going on and soon to be revenue sharing potentially with the House settlement, how does that all figure into what the tournament structure it looks like and who has access and how is that access provided? So those are all things that I wrestle with and that kind of keep me up at night. So I don't have a simple answer to your question. I know that's you were looking for a direct answer and I'm not giving you one. But I will say that I'm much more thoughtful about this topic than I would have been just a few years ago, because I think we really need to be future thinking about this and not just, stuck in the past where things are not going to be the same as they once were. And yet keeping the tournament successful, keeping the tournament beloved as it is, keeping what makes it special is also something that I will always protect with every ounce of my being.
What about the viewpoint where if you were to go to, say, 76 teams, people would say this degrades the meaning of the regular season even further? The games that might have mattered a little bit more in November, a little bit more in December, or even into the regular season and conference season. If you're allowing 8 more teams into the field, and those teams very, very well may prove to be overwhelmingly from the 5 power leagues, and you're not getting that on the bubble, on the fence, mid-major that's won 25 games, 26 games, and still can't crack in. A very strong argument is that you are taking some of the significance and urgency away from the regular season by the pure math of allowing 8 more teams into the field. How sensitive are you to that argument, and how prominent is that talking point or not in the committee room in recent months and years?
I get that and respect that sentiment. I think there are other sentiments to consider as well. I mean, and you look at other sports. I don't think that proved to be true in the first year of the expanded CFP, for example. I think in many ways it heightened the interest in the regular season because it brought more teams into the consideration. Now that is a field expand from 4 to 12.
Yeah, that's apples and oranges. That doesn't track for me, Dan. That's 4 to 12. The ratio isn't remotely the same. So I understand the point, but that one doesn't stack up to scrutiny. That to me is all.
But again, Matt, because of NIL, because of some of the November and December events, because some things that conferences may want to do outside of their conference season, you hear some talk sometimes about an in-season tournament like the NBA has done. I think there is some creative thought about how college basketball's regular season could play out in the future that may influence that as well. And so I don't know that there's a definitive answer to that. I think it's certainly a consideration in the whole grand scheme of things, but there are different lenses to look at that through, and I don't know if one opinion or perspective carries the day on that matter.
All right, last one for me on this topic, then I want to close on the NIT because I want to touch on that, and then I'll let you out of here.
Okay.
Having been a part of this discussion now for a number of years, Dan, how close do you feel with, I know you can't tell me if you think it's going to actually wrap up in April or whatever. It sounds like it's certainly not happening in March and next month when there's much more bigger matters and urgent matters to get to. But does it feel to you like this is nearing a conclusion, or is there still a healthy possibility that because the House case and the settlements that are supposed to take impact, this upcoming year, and there's still so much of this landscape in college sports that really has to settle over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, if not beyond? Like, is there a chance that this issue extends deeper into 2025, maybe even gets unresolved in 2026? Or do you think we are like 5-yard line, 10-yard line kind of stuff, and the answer of 68, 72, 76 gets done at some point in the weeks following the conclusion of the Men's National Basketball Championship?
Well, the most important thing to get across to your listeners and followers is that this is definitely not a fait accompli, that the recommendation to not expand the tournaments is absolutely a potential outcome here in the short term. For many of the reasons we just talked about, finances and tradition and different opinions and you name it. So I think it has felt like in some cases over the last few months there's been more reporting around, well, this is a done deal, it's going to happen, and I can assure you that that's not the case. I couldn't predict as I sit here today what the outcome is going to be. I do think that there will be an opportunity to make a decision about 26 sometime in the coming months. But if that decision is not to move forward with expansion, I don't know that is going to resolve the issue over the next 5 to 8 years either. That could be that the smartest thing to do is to wait and see whether or not House settlement happens and is approved by the judge on April 7th. What the ramifications of that going forward are, and whether this should be a topic that is considered a year or two from now more so than it is right now.
Mike Krzyzewski has said as much recently. I know Mike. I know you heard those words, and my stance on this. At minimum, I feel like that is the most proper point of approach here. Let's just see what kind of world we're stepping into over the next 3-4 years in college athletics before deciding to go on and inflate the tournament. We wait and see. Dan's a champ for getting a few of those on the record. Thank you. Let's close on the NIT. It has undergone some changes. I will invoke some editorial stuff here. There's now this thing called The Crown, which will air on Fox. It has, with me, it has nothing to do with the fact that it's on a different. I don't even care. They could not broadcast it. It could be broadcast to Mars. I don't even care. To me, it degrades what the NIT should be. I'm frustrated by it because you've got a splintered thing. For anyone that might not be familiar, you've got conferences like the Big East, the Big 10, and the Big 12. That in practice, if it plays out, they don't get into the NCAA tournament. A couple of the best teams will go and play in this thing called the College Basketball Crown that will happen in Las Vegas in the lead up to the Final Four. But other conferences like the ACC and the SEC, which don't have business relationships there, they are not going to play in it. So you have a splintering of high majors about who's going to play in the secondary tournaments. Now comes in the NIT. There's a new automatic qualifying process that has been amended yet again. So what do people need to know about a very long-running, proud tradition in the NIT, how it has changed this year, and anything and everything tied to this tournament, including a refresher on where the championship will be played. Of course, last season, it was at Hinkle Fieldhouse.
Sure. Well, thanks for asking. We're really excited about the NIT. We're actually coming off one of the most successful NITs in the last 10 years last year. We're proud of the partnership we have with ESPN to broadcast the NIT. As you noticed, this is the oldest postseason championship in college basketball, even older than the NCAA tournament. So we've had to make some modifications. We know that there's competition now in the marketplace with the College Basketball Crown. We think we've set up a really good, deep, and diverse and inclusive selection process. We actually had a team a few teams that have already qualified. So we brought back the automatic qualifiers for regular season conference champions who don't make the NCAA tournament by winning their conference tournament. Lipscomb, the Atlantic Sun, was the first one by winning their regular season, being the number one seed in the ASUN tournament, to qualify for the NIT. We haven't announced it yet because the regular seasons aren't over, but we have 5 other teams, High Point, Yale, Akron, Drake, and McNeese State, who have also qualified for the NIT. Now, they may go on to win the NCAA automatic qualifier, and we'd love to have them in March Madness, but if they don't, they have a home in the NIT, and hopefully they'll be excited about that. We think they will be. And we do have a qualification process for at least 2 ACC and 2 SEC teams that don't make the NCAA tournament field, and as well as the number one team, not an NCAA tournament team, among the top 12 ranked conferences using KenPom's conference ranking. And so that's inclusive of every major conference you can think of. And so we're really excited about the fact that we think we're going to have a 32-team NIT that has probably teams from as many as 16 or 17 or 18 different conferences. And in the finals will be played at Hinkle Fieldhouse at Butler University again this year, which we sold out last year with Indiana State beating Seton Hall in the championship game. And we're excited about the NIT and hope others will be as well, and we'll tune in to support a great event.
I think, Dan, objectively speaking, you've done this format, returning to the AQs for that was no brainer. Love to see that. Last year's NIT was great. The irony to all of it was Indiana State, I want to say, was the second team out of the field, and it got bid thieved. Like there was, and I remember talking with Josh Ertz amid all that. They didn't get in. He was like, I think we missed our chance. We'll see. And then lo and behold, if we had not had, I think last season had more bid thieves than I think any tournament ever. Like we had 5 or 6. And then they go on and they play this great final against Seton Hall. Hinkle's a perfect place to play it. And you know me. I love my college hoops. I don't want to see the NIT go away. I want to see it thrive to be the best that it possibly can be. And if it's not going to be in the Garden like every year the way that it was, Hinkle feels like the perfect spot to do it. In addition to being a hallowed hall for hoops, being right up the road from NCAA headquarters seems to make a lot of sense as well.
Well, thanks, Matt, and appreciate your support of that, and encourage you to promote those teams that do make the NIT field, because I heard from Lenny Acuff this morning, the head coach at Lipscomb, and he couldn't be more excited about knowing after a really successful season in the ASUN that his team's going to have a chance to play in the NIT should they not win the ASUN regular season, conference tournament and make March Madness. So that was the best phone call I had today, and I know other coaches will be excited about playing the NIT as well.
A good deal. I assume it's not technically a phone call. I assume this is number 2 for your day, Dan, right? This is number 2, second best. Yeah. No.
This is
Maybe was to like that 33-minute mark. It was going well.
It's a phone call, so this is the highlight. This is the
highlight. On that note, I'm going to cut you loose, but Drake right now, as we speak, is going to be a fascinating one. You mentioned Drake. It's one of the Missouri Valley regular season championship. Technically, the slate isn't done, but they've locked it up. Drake will be a fascinating, and there will be a number of fascinating resumes. We'll see. Maybe they get the auto bid. It's not an issue, or maybe they get the auto bid and we see how they get seeded. Because right now, Drake is 59 in the net, but it's resume metrics right now: 36 in KPI, 35 in strength of record, 40 in wins above bubble. Now the predictives aren't as strong: 79 in BPI, 64 in KenPom. And we've got 59. Hold on, I'm going to make sure that's right. 58 in KenPom, 53 in Torvik. They haven't had a lot of quad one opportunities, but this is why, folks, wins above bubble, strength of record are on the team sheet, because when you have mid-majors that don't get the scheduling opportunities, this is an empirically objective way to evaluate how a team is done against the schedule versus what the average bubble team will do. I'm not going to ask you a question. I'm just recapping all this stuff. Drake could be in the NIT. It could be the NCAA tournament. Right now, clearly has an NCAA tournament resume as far as I'm concerned. We are hitting it right now, Dan. Come on now. Next 2.5, 3 weeks. Come on. How good is this time of year? How psyched do you get? How little sleep do you get, Dan Gavitt?
I very rarely sleep this time of year. Very little. I was up late last night, very late, watching West Coast games. And to wrap it up, kind of where we started, I had the pleasure of watching Drake play in the Charleston Classic. I went there for a full day back in November. And, of course, they played Vanderbilt in the championship game of the Charleston Classic. And no one, including you, who knows this game so well, would have predicted back in November that Vanderbilt would beat Texas A&M last night and be right in the middle of the pack of the very deep and talented SEC, and that Drake would have the kind of season they're having, with an excellent coach from Division II and some great transfers from Division II. Really fun team to watch. I was impressed with them in Charleston in November, ever more so now. And it's just another example of why college basketball is so great, because unpredictable, and why the tournament is so spectacular, because everybody has a chance, and that team will have the chance to earn their way in over the Missouri Valley Conference championship game, and otherwise maybe be invited as an at-large as well.
It's almost like the system we have set up right now, where we have these conference tournament championships where everyone gets a chance to get an automatic bid into a field that's so well built at 68 teams. It's almost like it's the best possible system we could possibly build, and it doesn't need touching. Dan Gavitt, thank you so much for joining us on the Eye on College Basketball podcast. We appreciate you so much, and Dan, I look forward to, as always, getting a chance to run into you in person come NCAA tournament time.
Thanks, Matt. Be well.